now, and then let's get to where I'm going to let you drive. So let me get here where I can give you the controls. Advanced sharing options. All right, now you should, if you want to go ahead and send me a request to take the reins, Alex,
Perfect.
and I'll give you control and just lead us through this thing. And by the way, again, everyone, if you would, while you're watching, if you have questions, please just submit them in the chat, and Alex will get to those at the end of the presentation.
Perfect. Can you see that?
Yep, gotcha, man. Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, yeah, thanks again, everybody, for joining this morning, and yeah, thanks, Jason, for facilitating this. Looking forward to the discussion. I'll just give you a quick overview of what we'll plan to cover today. I want to talk a little bit about the history of what was formerly known as SilviaTerra. Now our company name is the Natural Capital Exchange. I want to talk a little bit about our origin story, just because I think that's an important context to how we got to where we are today. I want to talk about the NCX program, what makes it unique relative to other forest carbon programs, and then talk a little bit more tactically about how landowners can enroll in the program. And then we'll cover some FAQs at the end. So to start with, this screenshot doesn't actually include our full team. We're growing quite a lot as of late. So far in 2021, I think we've added something like 15 people to our team. But the thing that ties us all together is we're passionate about forests and working with landowners, especially to better value and measure forest ownerships and the asset that landowners are trying to work to manage and sort of manage some multiple different types of outcomes. We have marketing folks, we have a really robust data science team. We have folks on the buyer side of our exchange that are focused on connecting with corporate sustainability leaders. I work on the landowner side. I lead our landowner success team, so working with consulting foresters, landowners of all sizes across the U.S. To sort of share more about our program and facilitate participation in any way possible. So to start with, I want to talk a little bit about the history of our company. SilviaTerra was founded over a decade ago based on some research that Zach Parisa and Max Nova, our two co-founders, were doing at the Yale School of Forestry. You can see that's a picture of Max on the left and Zach on the right. They're really interested in using satellite imagery and advances in remote sensing technology to better measure and value forests. And so it's something that we've been doing for a really long time, using a combination of plot data that we've put in, FIA plot data, and satellite imagery, using multiple different sources there to be able to measure forests remotely. And that's allowed us to be really valuable partners to governments, NGOs, large TMOs, foresters. And really, we see our core competency as being able to measure forests. And that really came to a head in 2018 when we partnered with Microsoft to develop the picture you see in the bottom right of your screen, which is our base map product, which was the first ever sort of high resolution map of the forests across the contiguous US. And the real sort of step function moment there was that we were setting ourselves up to be able to do this inventory layer across the entire US on an annual basis. And that's really the underpinning of a lot of the work that we're doing now and focusing on now in the Natural Capital Exchange, which is sort of the lofty sort of long-term vision there, is that we would like to be able to measure and pay every forest landowner for every value on every acre every year. And that's sort of our, if we had a locker room with a sort of inspirational quote on the top of it, that would be our locker room quote. And yeah, using all of that sort of experience leading up to this moment on the remote sensing side, we've been able to jump into a really exciting forest carbon market opportunity. But ultimately, what we're really looking to do is, like I said, create a market where all landowners can be paid for all of the natural capital on their property. And right now, we're focused on forest carbon, and that's largely due to the fact that, for two reasons. One, there's a lot of interest and demand on the sort of buyer side of a forest carbon program like ours. It feels like every week there's a new company coming out with a new net zero carbon emissions pledge or something to that effect. So there's a lot of interest here, and people know that, I think, and people believe that forests can play a really important role in achieving some of those targets. Another reason why we're focusing on forest carbon is that SilviaTerra and NCX, has been privy to a lot of the development of some of these forest carbon programs. We helped, in many cases, get some of these programs, existing sort of conventional programs, off the ground with all of our work on the inventory side. And so we were familiar with how these programs are coming together, and we saw an opportunity to really change some fundamental pieces of them to make them more applicable and approachable for landowners. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. Today, to do the forest carbon program that we provide to folks, we leverage Basemap, which, as I talked about, is sort of our inventory layer across the entire U.S. And we also look at regional and local harvest data. And when we say harvest data, we're talking specifically of sort of mill pressure, market conditions, timber economics that help us understand, based on where a landowner's property is, what are all the factors that would influence whether or not it's likely that they would conduct harvesting in the coming year. And that's how we establish at scale for many different types of ownerships and properties. We're able to establish a business as usual harvest activity baseline for any given property. And then we give landowners the opportunity to sell a commitment to defer some or all of that timber harvest over the coming year. And that change in behavior results in additional carbon being retained on the landscape above a business as usual scenario. And then that's really what buyers are paying for. They're paying for the carbon offsets that can be generated based on that change in behavior. And so it's important to get that baseline accurate, because otherwise, a buyer might be paying for a change in behavior that doesn't actually need to be paid for, or it wasn't actually a real change in what that business as usual was. So there's it's an elegant solution, we think, but there's some really important critical things that we need to get right when we do that baseline assessment for a given landowner. As Jason noted, these carbon programs are really taking off, and we think we've had a really exciting year so far. In the 21B cycle, which was our first commercial scale program, we did run a pilot back in 2020 in Pennsylvania with 20 landowners, and we learned a lot about sort of how to facilitate the program and sort of tested our proof of concept. But starting in January this year, we really kicked it up a notch, and we expanded to the entire Southeast. We had over 120 landowners, or just under 120 landowners, have their bids accepted to sell their harvest deferral commitments. We then quickly spun up our next cycle, which actually closed for enrollment a couple weeks ago. That included Southeast again, Lake States, New York, Pennsylvania. We did assessments for over 1,500 landowners. And I'll talk about that assessment process in more detail in a bit. But ultimately, we had nearly 1,000 landowners submit bids to participate. So a really significant growth in just a 3-month period in terms of engagement and awareness and interest. Our auction results are still getting finalized. We'll be in the process of sharing those results more publicly in the coming weeks. But the main story I wanted to share here is that we're really seeing a huge uptick in interest and seeing a significant number of landowners that are keen to participate, and we're really excited about that. Right now, the 21D cycle is open. We do these cycles quarterly, so it's A, B, C, D throughout the year. So the last cycle of the 2021 era, or vintage, I suppose, is open right now. It'll include the entire contiguous U.S. So the whole lower 48 will be eligible to participate, and participation will be open enrollment will be open until early September. So I talked a little bit earlier about some of the more conventional forest carbon programs, and so maybe these are aspects that folks are familiar with, but I want to talk a little bit about what makes our program unique relative to those conventional programs. The first and probably the biggest difference relative to some of the other carbon programs out there is that NCX is a 1-year term. When we look at other programs, there are maybe 40-year-long commitments, or in some cases 100-year-long commitments. What we learned pretty quickly when we talk to landowners is that they're not interested in signing a multi-generational agreement. There are a lot of reasons why that's potentially folks are a bit cautious about that, which makes sense. That's a really long time period to commit to. Additionally, something that we like to highlight to landowners is that, at NCX, we really believe that the value that society places on something like a forest carbon program is only going to increase in the coming years as more companies sort of move towards this sustainability target goal. As these markets continue to develop, we think that signing a contract 1 year at a time allows for landowners to ensure they're always taking advantage of as much upside as possible in this marketplace, rather than signing a contract today that might lock you in at a price that might seem good today, but 30 years from now might feel like you're leaving something on the table. So, and then of course, just the sort of low risk of a 1 year term is something it's really, we think, friendly for landowners. And the way that we facilitate these 1 year terms is, because a common question folks will have is saying something like, well, a 1 year term, how is that doing anything on the environmental side? That I thought these companies wanted to offset their emissions and stuff like that. It's a good question. Our 1 year terms take kind of a simple approach in that we've done the math to determine the environmental impact that occurs when on the landscape or in the atmosphere when you sequester or retain 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent for a 100-year period. We've determined what's required to be retained over a 1 year period, since you have the same environmental impact of retaining that 1 ton over 100 sequential years. And that's a unit that we can measure and we can package together and then give to landowners as a opportunity to sell a harvest deferral commitment that is equivalent to that unit. And I'll talk about that math in a bit later, but there's also a very detailed white paper that you can read on our website about this methodology and the whole concept of ton-year accounting, which I think is a critical underpinning to what we're doing. 2 other details that make our program really unique are 1, there are no fees to participate for landowners, and 2, there are no acreage minimums to participate. And these are both related in that they rely, these factors of or I guess characteristics of our program rely on our remote sensing capabilities. Because we're able to do a lot of the work here and measurements remotely, we aren't requiring significant setup costs, like some of the other programs that might require a year's worth of ground measurements. And in some cases, we've heard stories of folks paying north of $100,000 just to do the ground measurements to participate in a program like ours. And that's another big barrier to entry, especially for landowners on the on the smaller side, but also large landowners maybe aren't interested in facilitating those payments. So, we've designed our program to really take advantage of our ability to efficiently measure and monitor change on the landscape at scale. And that means adding an additional property that's maybe on the smaller side. The marginal cost of doing that to NCX is pretty low, and so we don't actually have a minimum acreage requirement for our program. So we've had folks with as few as 25 acres who are able to participate because they have enough volume of timber harvest that we predict in the coming year, such that there's a reasonable or meaningful volume of deferral that they could commit and sell into the exchange. So this is a screenshot of our online platform. We'll see a demo in a second of our landowner platform, and it's a really important part of again being able to provide this program as an opportunity for soon to be hopefully tens of thousands of landowners to participate, to be able to sort of manage all of their information efficiently and communication. And we see it as being a really simple and lightweight enrollment process, which we think also benefits landowners. Unless you're very different from the typical landowner, most folks aren't interested in doing a bunch of unnecessary paperwork and extra setup stuff that really can again be a barrier to getting started. We like to have our program be streamlined and straightforward. So you can see here, there's a graphic here that sort of walks through the different steps. Pretty simple. You will, as an interested landowner, you would create your account at ncx.com/ncx/landowners. There's also some more direct URLs that we can share. But you add your property information, which is really just your property boundaries, some bit of contact information and property address information. You formally request an assessment of your ownership, at which point you would receive a report back from NCX, which details that business as usual baseline that I talked about earlier. And sort of you can interpret that number in that report as sort of what NCX thought was likely to come off your property in the coming year. And then you can submit your bids to sort of, you can choose the price at which you'd be willing to defer that harvest volume and the total volume that you'd be willing to defer. And then you submit that to the exchange. We try to find at the same time, our business development team is working on finding buyers, for every cycle to come in and purchase that supply offer from landowners. And then once we've been able to sort of match the supply and demand, the bids that are bid in at prices that are cleared by the market will be accepted. And then landowners just commit to reducing their harvest for a year per the sort of volume that they committed to. And then at the conclusion of that 1 year term, after verification measurements have been made, landowners will be paid per their commitments. So to enroll, you can go to either the URL on the bottom of your screen, or you can go to landowners.ncx.com, create that free account. Like I said, you'll be asked to provide some pretty basic, phone, email information and property address information. You'll then be asked to submit boundaries for all of the property under your ownership. The reason we ask for all the property under your ownership is so that we can avoid what's referred to in forest carbon programs as leakage. And that's where, in the scenario where maybe a landowner had two parcels, parcel A and parcel B, and they only enrolled parcel A in the program, they could reduce harvesting on parcel A, and it might look like overall there was sort of less harvesting occurring under that ownership. But if they just increased harvesting on parcel B, the net effect would be that there was no change on the landscape. And so that's not to say that any landowner would intentionally do that, but we are required, our methodology requires that the rules are such that you, as a landowner, submit all property under your ownership for assessment. That does not mean that you need to defer harvesting or cease harvesting across your entire property for the year. You can decide what volume of eligible carbon you'd like to bid into the exchange. And so, for example, in that business as usual baseline eligibility report that we send out to folks, let's say you were assessed as having 1,000 units of harvest deferral credits to sell. You could sell all 1,000, you could sell 500, you could sell 100. It really depends on how much of your harvest schedule you're willing to adjust. And so that'll really differ depending on the landowner. We've had really large landowners, TMOs, for example, that they're of course not going to be able to cease all their harvesting activity. So they're probably looking at producing it in a couple of different places across their ownership. And as a result, that maybe they're bidding in 20 or 30% of their total eligible carbon volume to make up for leaving room for all the other harvesting that they know they're going to be undertaking. So that's just to call out. There is a requirement. People sometimes get a little concerned or have questions about why we require all property under a given ownership to be enrolled. That does not mean that you need to cease all harvesting. You can still continue to harvest or thin, whatever you need to do. Once you receive that report back, we send those out typically on Thursdays every week. We'll be sending the first of those out for the 21D cycle starting in early July. You'll get that report back, and then you can decide if you'd like to proceed. There's no commitment. Once you request that report, there's no commitment to participate. You can review the results, and if you decide that maybe this year it's not going to be a fit for you, that's totally fine. And like I said, we did assessments for over 1,500 landowners in the most previous cycle, and look forward to doing many thousands more, hopefully in the 21D cycle. And then just to reiterate again, this assessment is totally remote. We don't have any foresters or any cruisers come to your property to do measurements at that stage. We do have some ground measurements later on if you do choose to participate, and I can answer questions about that. But the initial assessment is totally remote, and we don't require things like management plans or any other further documentation. So I talked a little bit about our online platform. This is a quick video that we put together just to show how simple it is for landowners to add their property information. And we just require a property boundary, and that allows us to look at base map and determine the inventory on a property or a set of parcels, a full ownership, like I discussed, and then also using spatial information such as mill locations, proximity of those mills relative to the landowner's property, haul routes to those mills, past harvest activity on the property, prices being paid in the region, all those different factors that would influence the likelihood of harvest for any given participant. We incorporate that as well in our assessment, but to do that, all we really need is your property boundaries, which is kind of neat that it's pretty straightforward, we think, from the landowner side. You have a couple options. You can click parcels that are pre-drawn on our map view from county tax offices. You can also upload shape files, or you can draw your boundaries in manually if you prefer to do that. So this is just a little video here. You can see, click and select parcels, it zooms in the map. This is something that our software engineering team has built recently. We definitely hear a lot of positive feedback on this feature because it makes it pretty easy to add your property information. Like I said, you can also add shapefiles if you have those. Click a few checkboxes to confirm that you've added all of your property boundaries and you understand sort of some of the basics of the program. Again, nothing's binding at this point. You can just submit your request for assessment, and then you'll receive your report back typically within about maximum of 10 days. Kind of depends on when you actually request it in that weekly cadence of us sending those out on a Thursday. We typically start processing a new batch on Monday, and so everyone who was enrolled up to that Monday would then have their report delivered on Thursday. So pretty simple. It's kind of like the football schedule on a weekly basis. All right. So I also want to share sort of a video that we took with a landowner who participated in the 21B cycle. This is a guy named Keith, based in Mississippi. Keith manages his own ownership and then helps his parents manage a sort of medium-sized tree farm they've been developing and adding to over the years. In this video, he talks a little bit about some of the sort of economic decision-making around the program, and I think it's important to sort of think about there's an opportunity cost to delaying harvest and delaying that cash flow for a landowner, and if they're extending that rotation age, but the economic benefits could be really meaningful if the timing and other factors work out for you. So I'll pause and let Keith do the talking for a second, but I thought this was an interesting video that's worth sharing.
Well, going back to the economic side of it, one of the things that we looked at was the weighing the harvest, what return you would get on the harvest versus leaving this timber standing and generating income from that. And it also allows the decision that we also made is that with the, going back to income addition, that it will allow the timber not to be cut, which in turn allows it to grow longer. And each year the timber puts on volume. It does two things. It'll absorb more carbon and it'll also grow in timber value. So it's a win-win going back to yearly income and more valuable timber in the long run, because we are able to delay the harvest of the timber, therefore keep it growing. And we can benefit from the hunting. We lease it to the hunters. They can enjoy the hunting of the timber also, but that's what was the deciding factor in getting into the carbon program and the in-capture program.
All right, let's move on a little bit here. So, throwing a lot of sort of information, sort of high-level information about the program, and then some more tactical stuff. In case folks are curious about sort of the timeline of events for the 21D cycle that we're currently in, if you're interested in learning more, you can head to our website and you can submit your property for that assessment that we keep talking about. That's open today. In early September, I think September 1st is the current date we're shooting for. The enrollment will close for the 21D cycle, and then at that point, sort of in the process of finalizing bid submission and moving forward with the actual contract, if you choose to do that. October 1st is when the harvest deferral period would actually begin for participating landowners. And then a year later, we'll be doing the verification measurements, and landowners will be paid per their agreement bids. So I will just quickly move through these FAQs here, and then we can sort of open it up to wider questions. Just ones that I want to cover proactively because we typically get asked these in pretty much every presentation we give. And the first one is, really important one is just how much will a landowner get paid per acre? And the answer here is it's really hard to know without knowing, because we get our assessments down to the property and individual ownership, and really take into account all the different factors that could be different from one participant to another. We try not to provide a range of per acre payments, just because inevitably it's going to be much more accurate if we ask a landowner just to submit their property for an assessment, and they'll get that business as usual baseline report back, and they'll be able to understand how their individual property was assessed. You could imagine a landowner who's got a stand that's it's very mature, it's ready for final harvest. It's got really nice stocking. It's been well managed. There's markets nearby. They've got sort of a transport all lined up, and they're ready to go with a logging crew. That landowner is sitting on potentially a very high likelihood of harvest piece of property, which would be assessed as such for our purposes in NCX. And so that landowner might get assessed a significant number of credits. A landowner with a similar property, but maybe stocking isn't quite there, they're much further away from mills. Prices being paid at the mills near them are not great. That landowner with a similar property would actually have they'd be assessed fewer harvest deferral credits, because there's less pressure or less likelihood of harvest occurring on their property due to some of those factors that I talked about. Maybe the stand's also not quite as mature. And so for two different landowners, let's say those are both 100-acre tracts, they'd have very different outcomes in our program, just due to the fact that the likelihood of harvest is really going to swing differently between the two. All that being said, we've seen prices range from as little as $5 an acre for an ownership, all the way to $30 plus for a ownership, and it'll obviously depend too, how you average out the payments for the payments across a wide range. You could have a couple really nice mature stands and a bunch of younger stands that are going to generate little to no credit volume, and that would bring down your average per acre. So again, for a lot of reasons, we try to encourage folks to just submit their property for an assessment so they can get an accurate estimate just for their property, rather than trying to guess a per acre payment. So I already touched on this one, but I just want to reiterate that even though it's a requirement for landowners to submit all the property under their ownership, they're not required to defer all harvesting across all of their acres. You can conduct thinning, you can conduct a clear cut, as long as you're accounting for those removals in your overall sort of bid volume that you submit to the exchange. Let's say you get assessed as having 100 of these harvest deferral credits, which represents a volume of timber harvest that you're going to be deferring. And I can talk more detail about what those units represent and then the volumes and whatnot, but think of that as you can think of a harvest deferral credit, just for simplicity. You can think of that as a light truckload of logs that's rolling off your property. If you got assessed as having 100 harvest deferral credits, that means that we think that in a business as usual scenario, in the next 12 months, you would probably 100 log trucks would roll off your property. And what NCX is doing is giving you the opportunity to say, well, maybe I'll reduce my harvesting activity, and only 50 log trucks will roll off the property, or only 25. And then you can sell the difference between what you were assessed as what you would have likely done and what you actually did or what you actually plan to do in the coming year. But you're not required to sell all 100 of those units. You can sell a volume that works for you. Another question we get is how much should a landowner charge for those deferral credits, that unit of deferred volume? And that's an important question. We have a lot of writing on this on our blog and sort of in our materials that we send out to participants. We really try to work through this with folks, and really the answer to this question is that it'll depend on the landowner. I used that example earlier of a landowner who's sitting on, potentially some, say they've got some really good saw timber that is getting a good price at a mill near them. The cost to delay that harvest will be different than a landowner who's maybe sitting on some lower quality pulpwood. Prices aren't great. It's going to cost them a lot for them to haul it to the mill. Those are two very different scenarios where a landowner might need to be paid more or less depending on their situation to actually defer that cash flow. So we do provide landowners the flexibility to bid between, I think it's $1 and $30 per harvest deferral credit, and that bid process is a key function of our program, and that it gives landowners the flexibility to offer the supply to the market at a price that works for them and not feel like they're locked in at a certain price. And so we had in the 21C cycle that just closed, we had, like I said, over 850 landowners submit their bids, and we could construct a real supply curve of what at different prices, what volume of these deferral credits could be secured, and then facilitated in transactions to the buying side of our marketplace. Speaking of the buyers, folks often are curious to know who's paying for this stuff. And as I alluded to earlier, mostly we're working with Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. Microsoft and Royal Dutch Shell are two big participants that we've worked with recently that we're allowed to speak about publicly. These are all companies that are making commitments on what's called the voluntary market. So these are companies that aren't necessarily in a sort of compliance regulatory market where they need to purchase these credits, but they've publicly stated that for various reasons they're interested in securing these offsets to reduce their overall carbon footprint as a company. And these offsets help them do that because in many cases companies are trying to reduce their emissions, but in areas where it's really expensive to reduce emissions or it's just not feasible, they're just Delta still needs to fly planes around the country to do business. They're going to need to offset those emissions in some places, and we're an exchange that allows them to do that. Another thing related to the buyer question is our certification process. We are in the process of getting certified by Verra, which is one of the certification bodies. We've had our concept note approved by Verra, which is a really important milestone. They've actually never approved a concept note and then not gone on to finish the sort of final approval and the certification for a program or methodology. Right now, we're in the period of public comment. Folks are weighing in with their thoughts and questions, and then we'll be incorporating that feedback into sort of a final version of our methodology. But we expect in the next 6 to 9 months to become fully certified through Verra, and that'll, I think, really drive up interest on the demand side, and hopefully also drive up the price that the buyers are willing to pay for our certified credits. Right now, the buyers that are engaging with us are doing so, with their own understanding of our methodology, and of course, having a company like Microsoft publicly express that they're working with us and they find us to be a great provider of these offsets is a huge win. But we're looking to continue to develop our leadership in the space. Consulting foresters have played a tremendously valuable role in the last 6 months for getting the NCX program out to landowners. And so we're really excited to be talking with the Bird Forestry team, just knowing that they're providing a real valuable service to their clients. And we think that NCX is another tool in the toolbox for both the landowner clients and also for the forester. And so we are actively developing and improving our online platform to make it easier for a forester or a consulting firm to manage multiple clients at once in sort of more of a dashboard view. We have a lot of documentation on our website for consulting foresters to take a look at, but we are very encouraging of foresters working with us, and on the flip side, we definitely encourage landowners who work with a consulting forester to engage their forester and and ask for their assistance in this program, because we think that this is a really interesting opportunity and worth exploring for landowners of all sizes across the U.S. But to be totally transparent, there are times where this program might be in conflict with other objectives that you may have worked through with your forester and your management plan, and it's important that you take other factors into consideration when you're exploring our program. And like I said, we think of it as a tool in the toolbox, and it might be the tool that gets applied this year or in the future, and it's important to have that conversation with your forester. A couple more questions here. Natural disasters are a question we get a lot of. We hear a lot of questions about natural disasters. The answer here is that our program is pretty flexible on handling cases where a natural disaster results in unnecessary or unintended removals. I should say unnecessary, unintended or unplanned removals on the property. There are no sort of major penalties there. Of course, in a one-year period or one-year contract, it's less likely that a hurricane or storm wipes through or wipes out your ownership relative to a longer time period. But there's still potential for a storm to hit, and we handle those in the following way. Basically, a landowner who isn't able to deliver their deferral commitment due to the standing timber being knocked over by a storm, they wouldn't be paid for that volume, but there wouldn't be any further penalties or damages that levied against the landowner. And the last one here, folks often ask if they can re-enroll every year, and the answer is yes, you can. You're not required to re-enroll. If you decide after a one-year period that you'd like to proceed with some heavy harvesting on the property, or you want to explore a different program that doesn't fit with ours, that's totally fine. But you are permitted to re-enroll if you'd like to do so. So it's something that it's pretty simple. You basically get reassessed with a new eligibility report. We'd reestablish what we think is the business as usual baseline, and then we go from there. So fairly straightforward. All right, that's it. I know we maybe went a little longer than I was hoping to, but I hope that was a helpful and interesting discussion. I'm going to turn off my screen. I'm going to pop back into Zoom here. Jason, maybe we can have more of a conversation.
Well, that was perfect, Alex, and thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Great information. And we did have a question that came across. It is, will your yearly carbon payment increase as the timber on a property grows and adds volume?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the carbon payment is, I guess, a combination of factors. It's both the number of the harvest deferral credits that you're assessed as a landowner, and then the sort of value of those credits. So I think the answer here is yes. As you put on more volume on your property, and as you reach that optimal rotation age for a given stand or for your set of properties or parcels, we would expect that those credits would go up. The other thing that could also happen is that the value of those credits could also increase. And I talked a little bit about how we see a lot of demand and interest growing on the demand side of our marketplace. So you might be in a situation where there's sort of a double effect there that increases the carbon payment number for a given landowner over time.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Well, and to respect everyone's time, and do we have any more questions? If so, please put them in the chat really quickly while we have Alex here. I think you covered it all, man. That was a very a rich presentation, and we're so grateful, Alex, for you making the time. And just to whether you are watching this live or you watch this later on, one of the things you mentioned is very important to Bird Forestry as a consultancy. We want to make sure that we are aware of everything that's going on with the carbon capture programs as it relates to timberland owners. And we don't want to look at this as, kind of, well, you're going to delay your harvest, which is, helping people through those timber sales is something that is very important to our business. But we also think that as a consultancy, we need to consult them on the highest and best use of their property first and foremost. It's one of the things that we always talk about at Bird, is that we are 100% landowner focused. And so we want to make sure that we're educated on this. And so we really appreciate it, Alex, that you making the time to help us as well as our landowners.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think, as you could tell, I was intentionally trying to lean in there. I think that's
Appreciate it.
something that we've learned. We've learned time and again with talking with folks that foresters have a really good handle of all the different priorities and balls that are being juggled. And we've thrown another ball in the mix here, and we think it's a good one, but it requires careful consideration. And forester is better equipped than pretty much anybody to help a landowner through that.
All right. Well, very good. Well, Alex, thank you so much. If there's anything that we can do to repay the favor for you giving us this time, just let us know. Let's stay in touch. And to anyone watching, if we can ever be of service, you can always reach us at birdforestry.com. You can also sign up for our newsletter. I'm actually going to put this on our YouTube channel, and then I'll also disseminate it out through the newsletter, so that for anyone that didn't get to see it, they can come back and watch later. And with that, Alex, man, thank you so much, brother. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Take care.
Okay, thank you. And everyone, I'm going to sign off for now. I'm going to end the recording.